For this day that you've given us, that you've provided us here to gather and ultimately learn your word, Lord. Today as we study the book of Daniel, chapter 8, I pray that you've prepared me well enough to teach. I pray that the audience learns about Antiochus and how he foreshadows the Antichrist to come. And I pray that ultimately our study in this chapter just brings you glory, Lord, and better prepares us to teach others about you and to grow closer to you and just understanding that you were involved in all of history, Lord. And I pray this all in the matchless name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, so chapter 8, we're going to try to get through all this chapter today, and then we're going to be taking a break. So the reason why we're going to take a break is because next week, weather permitting, we're going to be doing the baptism out at the lake, so we're not going to be doing this study there. Sure, but either way, I won't be teaching next week, and then I will be available the week after. However, for that one, we're just going to do a quick one-day class that I have prepared that's not Daniel related, because the next chapter after this obviously is chapter 9. And I don't want that to be interrupted with a break, because after that week, I'll be in vacation and a lot of people will be traveling for 4th of July anyway. So after 4th of July is when we're going to pick back up on Daniel and do chapter 9. Okay, so in order to do all that, we need to get through 8 today. So here we go. So chapter 8 chronologically takes place after 7 and before chapter 5. So as you can see here on this chart, we learned last week that chapter 7 takes place in the first year of King Belshazzar's reign. Chapter 5 takes place at the end of his reign, when the writing on the wall happens, and ultimately Belshazzar dies, and the Medo-Persian Empire conquers them and moves into power. So chapter 8 is nested in between 7 and 5, however, it's towards the front end of his reign, and you'll see that on the next slide. All right, take us to the next slide. Okay, so I'll just read this one here and then we'll talk about it. I got some maps to reference here. So in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after that one that has already appeared to me. He's talking about the one in chapter 7. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. Did I pronounce that right, Jeff? Ulai Canal. That's what we're going to go with here. All right, so I have here on the maps here, just to kind of bring you into where we are geographically so that you can understand where it is. And then also I have a map depicted from the Medo-Persian Empire that shows the palace of Xerxes in Susa next to the Ulai Canal. That's that middle map there. And then the map on the right is modern day depiction. So all you really need to get from this is that, let's just hit up the notes here. So first and foremost, this chapter and all following are now back in Hebrew. So what that tells us is that his intended audience now is no longer the Gentiles that he was writing to for them to study, etc., and the kings, but more so that this one is going to pertain to the Jewish audience. So he switches it back up. It's back in Hebrew. This is in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign, which I just talked about in the last slide, which means it's between chapter 4 and 5, but after chapter 7, which gives us about the year 553 BC, because Belshazzar's reign started roughly in 550 BC, okay? And the location he's describing is about 150 miles to the east of Babylon, and you can see that on that first map there. So geographically, where he's having this vision taking place at is actually inside Persia. Okay? So he recognizes this place. He recognizes that the citadel of Susa is like the palace of the Persian Empire at that time. And he's having this vision in vicinity of that canal, right outside of that citadel. Right? We know from the prior studies that the Medo-Persian Empire takes control after Babylon, right? That happens in chapter 5, where Darius conquers Babylon and he becomes the king, right? So he's having this dream in Belshazzar's reign, who still is from Babylon. But this vision's taking place in Persia. So it kind of foreshadows what this vision's going to be about. Okay? Take us to the next slide. Any questions on that? I know that was a lot of rambling there. All right, Braden, can you read us 3 and 4?
I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the camp, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it changed toward the west and north and the south. No animal would stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased, and it came great.
Okay, so here we see that Daniel sees a ram, and this ram is going to animalistically represent a kingdom, right? Same thing how all the other dreams were. In the chapter 2 statue, you had a vision of a statue, and each component of that statue represented a Gentile kingdom. And then in chapter 6, you had the 4 beasts, each one representing the kingdom. Now we're going to focus in on the Medo-Persian and ultimately another kingdom as well after them, which is the Grecian Empire. All right, so he sees this ram. This ram has 2 horns. We talked about it in chapter 2. The 2 arms represented the Medes and the Persians. In chapter 6, we talked about it, how the bear was lopsided. One shoulder was bigger than the other. That indifference of size represented the Medes and the Persians because the Persians outgrew them. All right. Similarly, that's why this ram has 2 horns. So we know that we're talking about the Medo-Persian Empire animalistically as a ram. Okay? And then in verse 4 here, Daniel says that he watched this ram as a charge to the west, to the north, and to the south. In chapter 6, Terry, what did the bear have in its mouth? 3 ribs, right? And those ribs represented the military conquest of the Medo-Persian Empire, right? That's the same thing that's happening here. The reason why the ram charges to the north, to the west, and to the south are those 3 military conquests that they did. Babylon, Egypt, and Lydia. Okay? Take us to the next slide. Any questions on that one before we move on? No? All right. Jen, can you read 5 and 6? Kim, can you read 7? And Chaz, can you read 8?
As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horns from its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came towards the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage.
I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power.
The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven.
Okay, so let's visualize this here. So Daniel is standing in this canal, and then he sees a ram. And this ram has 2 horns, and it runs to the north, it runs to the west, it runs to the south. And everywhere it goes, it's defeating anything that stands up against it. Medo-Persian Empire, okay? Then, all of a sudden, he sees a goat. And this goat comes in and just absolutely wrecks the original ram from the dream. So the question now is, who is the goat? And then who is this prominent horn on the goat? And then what does it represent when that prominent horn is smashed and broken off, but then 4 new little horns come up out of that? What are we talking about, Chaz?
It's the Grecian Empire, and then the prominent horn would be, I can't remember his name. But
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great, and then the 4 small horns, so that whenever the large horns are broken, it's when Alexander is killed. And then the 4 prominent horns are his 4 generals that came into power.
Absolutely. And that's the same thing that, first of all, that we know from history, right? So it's historically accurate. But then B, we also know of that from the chapter 6 vision. And then in chapter 6, you had the leopard, but the leopard had 4 heads and 4 sets of wings, right? And we talked about that at length in that chapter. So that's why Daniel's seeing this goat having 1 big prominent horn that's broken off, 4 little horns are popping up afterwards.
And here it talks about, what each the ram and the goat represents, Greece for the goat and everything, but symbolically in the Bible, what is a ram versus a goat? Because my vision of a ram is more, it's a more refined goat. Goat is a scrawny kind of animal, but do you know anything about the symbologies?
So I did read on it when I was doing this, and once again, that was like months and months ago. So I'll try to remember the best I can. But it's not biblical symbology, but cultural symbology. At that time, a lot of the people referred to the Greeks as goats. And like that's just like an image that they had of them. Why, I can't remember. There was a reason. If you want to know, I can get back to you on that. But
I'm thinking a goat is less than a dominant ram, you know, it's like a reject or something.
Well, and that goes right back to the statute, the vision of the statute. Remember, they had gold and then silver and then bronze, so successively, these kingdoms are more powerful, but they're less majestic, less splendid. Right?
It also makes me think like a goat, kind of going back to the leopard, right? It's more agile, it's smaller, it's like faster.
yeah.
You know, like those kind of things.
No, absolutely. All right, take us to the next slide. All right, so as we just talked about, the goat represents Greece, the horn represents Alexander the Great. History can confirm that when Greece invaded, they invaded from the west. So that's why Daniel saw this goat coming from the west. All right, when he says in verse 6, wait, I think it was 6. No, verse 5. Crossing the whole earth without touching the ground, Daniel is describing how rapidly the Grecian conquest was. Right? And we talked about that's why the symbology of the leopard was used, to talk about the swiftness of Alexander the Great's military and how just historically remarkable it was for how fast their military conquest was.
Going back to the ram and the goat, because if you study Alexander the Great's battles, you see that it was very unconventional in the way he attacked his enemies. Now, going back to the ram and the goat, we've all seen the National Geographic of the ram, right? They won't face off, and they just keep doing the same thing. But now, have we ever been to a kid's zoo, seen him go? They'll headbutt you anywhere they get hold of you. Right? They're not going to stand there and face off. They're just going to attack. That's the same thing with Alexander.
That's true.
Persians were wanting to line up like they had always done. All the other militaries did. And Alexander was just totally unconventional.
That's true.
Maybe that's part of it. I don't know.
Yeah. All right, so basically, as we mentioned, verses 5 through 8 here are talking about how Greece would conquer the Medo-Persian Empire, and then ultimately Alexander the Great would die an untimely death, which we know historically is accurate, and then how his 4 top generals would take power of that empire and ultimately emerge from it. All right, take us to the next slide. All right, I will read 9 and 10. Andrew, could you do 11? And Kelly, can you do 12? All right, so out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of heavens, and it threw some of the starry host down to earth and trampled them.
It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down.
Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground.
Okay, so in verse 9 here, when he says, out of one of them came another horn. So what he's talking about contextually is you had the 4 horns that came after the prominent horn. So Alexander the Great dies, 4 generals emerge. Those are the 4 horns. He's saying out of one of them comes another horn. So we know that those 4 horns represent the 4 Ptolemaic kingdoms historically after Alexander the Great died, because his kingdom kind of split into 4, and we talked about that. So what he's saying here is another horn will come out of one of those 4 kingdoms. Okay, so that horn, we know, is going to be a person. All right? That horn represents a man named Antiochus Epiphanes, and we talked about him last week, and we're going to talk about him at length today, and then we're going to cover him again in even more detail come chapter 11. And if you remember from last week, he represents a foreshadowing of the Antichrist to come. Okay? So, to the south is referring to the wars led by Antiochus against Egypt. To the east is referring to his conquest of Armenia and into Persia. And then towards the beautiful land is referring to his conquest towards and into Jerusalem. All right, those are all historic conquests. You could read about them in history. You could pull up Britannica and read literally like a bi-page battle account of like all the things I'm talking about. Christian.
Was he one of the four, or was he someone who was under one of the four?
He was one of the ones under the four. Yeah, so he comes out of that kingdom, and we'll talk about it on the next slide. All right, so then verse 10, it grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw down the starry host to the earth and trampled them. All right, so what he's talking about there is the persecution of the Jewish religious hierarchy and leadership. So whenever we're talking about like the starry or the host of the heavens, he's not talking about God, he's not talking about angelic beings, he's not talking about Jesus. He's more so talking about the religious leaders of the church at that day, the Jewish church, in the temple, the Pharisees, if they were called Pharisees yet, if not, whatever it was they were called back then. But that's who he's talking about, how he would persecute this leadership of the Jewish church structure. Okay? And ultimately put some of them to death, which is why it says trampled on them. All right? In verses 11 and 12, Daniel is describing how he removed any leaders that were over the Jews and replaced them, how he would put an end to the daily sacrifices and religious offerings, and how he treated the temple. Antiochus wanted to be the God of all the people that he ruled. And then in verse 12, God allowed this to happen because of the Jews' transgression against God. All right, so once again, we're going to cover this a little bit today, but I'm going to cover it in more detail in 11. All right, but just to give you a summation of it, is at the time of Antiochus, so we're talking like 200-ish years BC, like 160s, like from 200 BC until like 170 BC, that like 30-year span. The Jews were once again going against God. They're once again worshiping false gods. They were questioning God. They were allowing themselves to be Hellenized by the Greeks. Like, they were just going against God completely. And some of the leaders of the church, some of the leaders of their nation were corrupt and were willing to like be bribed, and all sorts of things were happening. All right, so because of that transgression, God is allowing Antiochus to do what he did to them. That's what he's saying there in verse 12. Any questions on that? Once again, I'm going to cover it in much greater detail in chapter 11 when we give like a by account breakdown of what Antiochus does.
I will say in verse 11, to me it's very similar to when Satan, stood up to God. It says, it set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord when he was in the band. I can kind of see some similarities.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Even his name, Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes. He took the name Epiphanes. We got our word Epiphany. And what he's saying by using that name is, hey, I'm revealing God to you. I'm God myself. Antiochus Epiphanes. So God revealed what that is.
All right, take us to the next slide. All right, so this is Antiochus Epiphanes. I found a picture of him. Not really sure how accurate it is, but either way, gives you an idea of who we're talking about.
Only ancient Greeks.
Yeah. Either way, he was born in 215 BC. He reigned from 175 BC until 164 BC. He captured Jerusalem in 167. Desecrated the temple by offering the sacrifice of a pig on an altar to Zeus, which he erects inside of the temple itself. He prohibits Judaism, demands that copies of the law be burned, forced religious leaders to eat pork, end circumcision and other Jewish practices, killed non-complying Jews. All right, and then another thing is he also led a conquest against Jerusalem in 169 BC. But that's just because he backed a guy named Jason who was super corrupt and like took a bunch of money from him. And like there was a coup against Jason, so Antiochus comes in and like crushes it. He leaves, but when he comes in 167, like he never leaves again. Like that's the real conquest. All right, so that's why there's like two different dates that you might read in history. Just understand, I also am talking about that as well. All right, take us to the next slide.
When you look at the dates, it's pretty close to when, it's not that far away from when Jesus was born when you look at the dates, you know?
Yeah, it's coming.
Yeah.
It's coming up. I mean, you got about another, from the time that, in 164 BC, when Judas Maccabeus, like, leads the revolution and recaptures and recleanses the temple, we're only talking another 150-ish, 160 years until Jesus pops onto the scene. All right, so this is from the book Antiquities of the Jews from a Jewish man named Josephus. All right, so I've used them before in my classes. I'm not going to read all this, so what I will do is I'll just be quiet for a couple minutes and I'll let you read it on your own. But just understand that Josephus was not a Christian. He's a Jewish man, and he wrote a lot about history of the Jews during the time of Jesus and before the time of Jesus. He was a historian, right? So he has it captured about Antiochus and all the things that he did. And once again, this is a non-biblical account, and it just confirms Scripture, right? So I'll shut up now, and I'll give you a couple minutes to read through that on your own. And then if there's anything that you see that you want to talk about or bring up, go ahead. Okay, let's move on. Any questions or talking points that anyone wants to bring up? Basically, the highlights from it is he comes in, he conquers, he destroys a bunch of stuff, he Hellenizes everybody. He goes into the temple and he erects an altar of Zeus. He desecrates a temple, which is known as an abomination of desolation from the Bible. But the term when we say about an abomination of desolation, especially when Jesus says it, he's talking about what the Antichrist will do. But similarly, the Antichrist is going to do everything that you see Antiochus do, just on a whole nother level, on a much more severe level.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what Jesus says, 180, 190, 200 years after this event, Jesus says, there's coming an abomination of desolation. Pointing back to this, but saying it's a future event that is coming.
Yep.
That they are doing.
All right.
It's not, as some believe, the abomination of desolation. This is a precursor.
Yep.
It's a foreshadow.
All right, take us to the next slide. Okay. I'll just read these ones. Then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to him, "How long will it take for this vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people." He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." All right, so in verse 13 here, Daniel's implying that he overheard two angelic beings discussing this. All right, and those angelic beings were having a conversation about the vision that Daniel just saw. Okay, because obviously God is giving Daniel this vision, and similarly, how in the past an angel accompanied that vision to provide clarification, that's what's happening here. Right, so the angels are talking to each other, and they say, how long will it take for this to be fulfilled? Because they're appalled by what God's people are not only doing, but how they're being treated by Antiochus and the desecration of the temple, which goes against God, and they're just greatly concerned about it. So they're having a conversation, all right? And then in verse 14, the angel who asked the question answers to Daniel. So basically, he gives the answer that the other angel gave to him. And he says to Daniel, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. All right, so this can mean several different things. All right, and I tried to research it, and similarly to prior classes, is like I found two main camps, right? Two different camps of theology on like what this can mean. So I'm just going to present both of them to you, but it doesn't really matter anyway, okay? I'm just letting you know. All right, so this could mean 2,300 days, which would translate to about 6.5 years, okay? Or it could mean 2,300 sacrifices, because of the Hebrew usage of the words and how they view days. So it could mean 2,300 evenings and mornings, could mean 2,300 evening sacrifices and morning sacrifices. So there could be either or, all right, which would mean that would break it down to about 1,150 days or approximately 3 years, okay? So once again, it's a debate against scholars as to when the start time for this either 6-year timeline or 3-year timeline begins. But what we do know is that Judas Maccabeus led a revolt against the Seleucid Empire and restores the Second Temple in 164 BC. That's a historic fact. You can look it up. Okay, so if we know that the end date of the temple's cleansing is 164 BC, and we know that roughly Antiochus conquered Jerusalem in 167 BC, that's a 3-year timeline, which means if this is what we're talking about, it's most likely probably the morning and evening sacrifice prophecy, not necessarily 2,300 days. Because the 3-year timeline lines up with the 3-year.
It goes right back to the language used in Genesis during creation. And there was evening, there was morning, and Thursday.
Yeah.
Evening and Thursday. So when you take, typically when it says morning and evening, it's talking about one day.
Yep. So either way, like I said, the 2,300 evenings and mornings doesn't really pertain to us because at the time it was a futuristic prophecy, so it greatly concerned them because it was things that were going to come to them. But for us, it's a historic prophecy. So it doesn't really apply to us.
That's the event that gives us Hanukkah.
What's that?
That's the event that gives us Hanukkah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That was during the cleansing of the temple. They only had enough.
Like after Judas Maccabeus?
Yeah, they only had enough oil to burn one day, but God miraculously kept it burning off.
Well, thank you for that.
That was part of the cleansing of the temple.
Interesting. All right.
That's your freedom.
Thank you. All right, take us to the next slide. All right, I'm done reading for a minute. Christian, can you do 15 and 16? Jenny, can you do 17? Fawn, would you like to read? Do you want to do 18? And then back over. Would you like to read? Okay. Could you do 19? Okay. Yep.
While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Goliath calling, Gabriel, tell this man in the vision.
As we came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end.
While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep, with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet.
Okay, so in 15 and 16 we learn that the angel named Gabriel is back on the scene here, and he's going to be the one to provide an interpretation and clarification of this vision to Daniel. All right, and then in 17, 18, and 19, Once again, this one can have multiple interpretations depending on what scholarly source you're looking at or what scholar you're talking to. This could mean that the vision concerns the end times, and that Antiochus is seen as a precursor of the Antichrist, and how he ruled, desecrated the temple, demanded worship, etc. are all very similar to the second coming and future Antichrist. Or 17, 18, and 19 could be interpreted as this is simply talking about the end of Antiochus. All right, so it's two different ways you could look at it. Either one is accurate. They're both accurate, so you could use both or a combination of both. It doesn't really matter. Just understand that where you do your studies, you're going to find different answers as to like what 17, 18, and 19 mean. All right, take us to the next slide. All right, so then I'll read this one. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn behind its eyes is the first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation and will not have the same power. All right, so Gabriel clearly articulates here the same meanings that I've been giving you this whole class. But now it's no longer ambiguous. It's clear and overt. Like, we're not guessing now that the chest from the statue was, the Medo-Persians, and that the bear is the Medo-Persians, and that the ram is the Medo-Persians. Like, clearly the angel gives them verbatim what it represents. So everything I've given up to you so far has been accurate, okay? And then, take us to the next slide. And then this will close this out here. So let's do 23 and 24, Braden. 25, Jenny. That Jen. My Jen. And then 26, Chaz. And Kim, will you close us out with 27?
In the latter part of the reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, and a fierce-looking king, a matter of intrigue will arise. You will become very strong.
Am I reading 24?
Huh?
Am I reading 24?
Hugh's reading 23 and 24. You got 25.
You will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause outstanding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty or holy.
He will cause the seat to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince and princes. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power.
The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seed up the vision, for it concerns the distant future.
I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding.
Okay, so in verses 23, 24, and 25, Gabriel describes how Antiochus will rise from one of the four kingdoms after Alexander the Great. He describes how it will not be from his own doing, but it's because God is allowing him to rise to power because it ultimately fulfills his will, and because of the transgression of the Jews against God during that time. Okay, so there's that. And then in verse 25, he's describing how the Jews felt secure under Antiochus, under his predecessors, because they were allowed to worship, etc., as long as they just paid their taxes. But he will come in, persecute, kill, and oppress them. Eventually he will be removed, but it won't be by human power. It'll be through God. All right, that's why it says, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So during the revolution, Antiochus isn't killed. Antiochus simply retreats, he goes off, and then he gets sick, and he dies. So that's why it says here that he will not be destroyed, but not by human power. He's not killed militarily on the battlefield during the revolution, but instead he falls sick and dies. All right? And then also another key takeaway here is verse 25 seems very, very familiar similar to the Antichrist's actions and ultimately his destruction, right? Because what is this whole thing, and that's why I've been saying the Antichrist Antiochus foreshadows the Antichrist, because similarly they're going to do the same exact thing, right? As Antiochus rose to power, he betrayed people, he took advantage of people, he set covenants and went back on his word, he was super sly, and once again I'm going to cover all this in chapter 11. He makes a deal with the Jews, and then he goes against the deal with the Jews, and then he desecrates the temple, bans Judaism, creates an abomination of desolation, and then eventually God's people remove him, similarly how Jesus will remove the Antichrist, and that how Antiochus dies but not from human hands, he dies ultimately from God's hand. Same thing with the Antichrist.
Do you know what's referring to when it says he can stand against the princes? I see that for with Jesus, but I was wondering if there's some parallel in that time.
Which verse are we? Verse 25. So when they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the prince of princes. Honestly, no, I don't. Do you know?
Well, I mean, if you're looking at the ultimate fulfillment, it's talking about the Antichrist and the war against Christ. Here, I believe with Antiochus, it's talking about he is, again, taking his stand against the God of heaven because of what he does in the temple.
Yeah.
He erects a statue of Zeus, and he slaughters a pig on the altar. So he's worshiping a false God and trying to get the people to worship the false God. So he's raising himself up against the Prince of Princes, or God in heaven. And by his name, that he takes on himself to. He's declaring himself to be God, which is what the Antichrist will.
Yeah. All right, and then unfortunately in verse 26, the angel doesn't give any clarification on the meaning of the 2600 evenings and mornings. He just says, just don't worry about it, it's true, seal this up, because it's going to take place in a long time from now. Because once again, this is like 400 years before the events actually transpire. All right? And then in verse 27, Daniel admits that this vision was deeply troubling. Once again, he doesn't really understand what's going on, similar to the vision in chapter 7 about the beast and the Antichrist and all those things that are foreshadowing and to come. It troubles him, and he just says, like, enough is enough, doesn't ask any more questions, and that closes out the chapter. All right, take us to the next slide. Okay, so to sum it all up, by approximately 553 BC, Daniel receives a prophecy that the Medo-Persian Empire would be destroyed by the Greeks. Once again, they're not even in power yet. Babylon is still in power, all right? That the Greek Empire would be split into 4 separate kingdoms, and out of them, one would come that would grow as he went south and east, and eventually to Jerusalem, which is Antiochus Epiphanes, and persecute the people and desecrate the temple. And then finally, he recorded that approximately 3 years later, the temple would be restored, and all of it matches the historic timeline. All right, so I put this in here so you could kind of see what happens from the time that this prophecy is revealed to Daniel all the way up until essentially when Rome finally takes full power. All right, so Daniel receives this prophecy in 553. Greece doesn't even pop onto the scene for another 200 years. All right, then Alexander the Great dies in 323 BC. Rome starts to grow, but it's not really a thing. All right, it's just starting to grow. In 264 BC. In 215 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes is born in the Seleucid Empire. All right, then he eventually he's put in Roman, like a Roman prison as a replacement for like his dad. He's released from the Roman prison. And then from 170 to 168, he leads the conquest I talked about. 168, Rome now begins to occupy all the Mediterranean territories. But once again, like, they still haven't outbeaten all the Ptolemaic kingdoms just yet. All right? Antiochus seizes Jerusalem in 167. For 3 years, that's when he oppresses the people, desecrates the temple, bans Judaism. 164, Judas Maccabeus restores the second temple. And then in 133, that's when Rome finally squashes out the last little bit of resistance in Asia Minor and takes place, and that's when that transition of power happens from Greece to Rome. Kelly.
So was Judas Maccabeus Jewish?
Yeah.
So he was like in story 7.
Yep.
And if I'm not mistaken, he was of the Levitical tribe. He was a priest.
And then also, that's why, so in Catholicism, they have first and second Maccabeans or whatever. We don't consider it canon, but it's there.
They have the apostles, they have some extra books in the Bible
Yeah.
that were declared to be canon.
Either way, they're good.
Across the Revelation.
There's a lot of good historic data that you could pull out of there.
I mean, it's good.
So, all right, take us to the final slide. All right, so this is like probably one of the most important things of chapter 8. Of my class on chapter 8 is like this point right here. All right, so by this stage in the book, we now know that God has entrusted Daniel to record prophecy that pertains to both the Israelites and the Gentiles. Okay, so that's super important to understand. Because up until Daniel, for the most part, all the prophecies were only directed to the Jewish people. But now, you have Daniel, who is receiving prophecies that actually pertain greatly to the Gentiles, because all these prophecies are talking about a progression of Gentile kingdoms. So you need to understand that for when we get into chapter 9, all right? And then the next one is that God has educated Daniel on the Antichrist, the tribulation, the Messiah, and the end of days, all right? So that's also greatly important to understand, because if you don't understand that, come chapter 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, you're going to get really lost really quick. All right? You need to understand that both of those points are super relevant and important to remember contextually for when we go into chapter 9. Because in chapter 9, we're going to get like a 490-year prophecy, and it's going to predict the exact day that Jesus Christ will come into Jerusalem. And it all makes sense because of everything else that was revealed to us. All right? The Jewish people don't want to believe that that was what they're talking about in that 490-year prophecy. But it has to be. And I will teach that in 2 weeks whenever we pick up chapter 9. Because the rock in chapter 2 was a God cut out rock that smashes his temple, right? It smashes his statue. That was the Messiah. In chapter 7, what does Daniel see before the throne? He sees the Son of Man come down from the clouds and present himself in front of the Ancient of Days on the throne and receive the power and the authority to install this everlasting kingdom, right? That's the Messiah. Okay, so then when we get to chapter 9, the Jews don't want to believe that we're talking about the Messiah. Well, who else would we be talking about? Daniel's already heard this from God. He's already had it in multiple prophecies. Okay, so just remember that. All right? And that is all I have for chapter 8. And then once again, we're going to be taking a break. Next time we do Daniel, it'll be after the 4th of July, that following Sunday. And just buckle up, because chapter 9, it's going to probably take us like 3 or 4 weeks to get through. It's super long, not scripturally long, but my class is long, because there's so much detail that we have to go over. So it would behoove you to read ahead.
You were just referring to chapter 7, the Son of Man and his approach to eternal God. You said Jewish people don't want to believe that's the Messiah, or they don't want to believe that's Jesus?
They believe that that was the Messiah. But what I'm saying is when you get to the 490-year prophecy, they're like, when we talk about this anointed one, or the Holy of Holies, that is going to come after the 62 sets of 7, plus, whatever. So after 483 years, this anointed one will come, and he's going to be cut off. and that anointed one will remove sin and atone for sin and bring in everlasting righteousness, all these things, right? Well, they don't want to believe that that was Jesus Christ, because in doing so, it defeats their foundation of faith, you know? Yeah, so they twist the numbers and they don't, they just try to avoid it. But it's like when you look at it, there's literally, I don't want to steal my thunder. 2 weeks, I'm going to make the clearest of cases of exactly when the start date is and like how and why everyone else in the world knew to expect Jesus Christ, because they all believed. Now, looking back on it, people don't want to believe that. But it's clear. They all knew it. But that's all I have. Also going forward, just